Jerry Shriver was the soldier everyone feared and admired, the kind of man who took missions others would never dare to accept. But the same battlefield that built his legend finally swallowed him. And the scariest man of Vietnam met a brutal end in a way that still haunts those who knew him. Jerry Michael Shriver was born in 1941 in the small town of Defuniak Springs, Florida. This was a time when the United States was still recovering from the Great Depression. Families were trying to rebuild their lives, and many lived with very little. Shriver's family wasn't wealthy, and like many boys in small-town America, he grew up knowing hard work from a very early age. Life was simple, but it could also feel limited, with few chances for someone who wanted adventure. As a child, Shriver was described as restless. He wasn't the type to sit still for long. He had an energy that needed an outlet, and he quickly grew tired of the routine of school and small-town life. By his teenage years, he started dreaming about a bigger world. He wanted escape, purpose, and something that would test him in ways small-town life never could. The military looked like the path that could give him all of that. In the late 1950s, not long after finishing school, Shriver enlisted in the U.S. Army. At that time, the Cold War was shaping military life. The Army was training hard, preparing for the possibility of conflict anywhere in the world. Shriver became a paratrooper, one of the soldiers trained to jump from planes straight into combat zones. This was not easy work. It required courage, stamina, and discipline. Many young men who signed up for it dropped out during training, unable to take the strain. Shriver, however, stood out. He didn't just pass. He thrived. He showed a toughness that impressed his instructors. When others grew tired or gave up, he seemed to push harder. He had an unusual resistance to pain and fear, and this made him different from most of his peers. From early on, he proved he was willing to do whatever it took to succeed, no matter how grueling the task. As the 1960s began, the U.S. military was watching events unfold in Southeast Asia. Vietnam was becoming a hot point in the Cold War. The U.S. believed it had to stop the spread of communism there, and that meant sending its best men into a very difficult fight. It was around this time that Shriver took another step up in his career. He volunteered for the Green Berets, also known as the U.S. Army Special Forces. These were no ordinary soldiers. They were trained to survive in the harshest conditions, fight behind enemy lines, and complete missions that others could not. For Shriver, this was the perfect fit. The Green Berets would allow him to use his toughness, his willpower, and his restless hunger for danger. It was also the place where his darker side would begin to show itself. When he first set foot in Vietnam in the mid-1960s, the war was changing quickly. At the start, the U.S. had believed that sheer firepower would be enough to control the situation. But Vietnam was not like other wars. There were no clear battle lines. The fighting was hidden in villages, jungles, and narrow trails. The enemy used guerrilla warfare, including hit-and-run attacks, surprise ambushes, and traps in the jungle. For American soldiers, it was a nightmare. This was the kind of war that demanded men who could adapt, move fast, and take risks. Shriver was exactly that kind of soldier. From the beginning, he showed he could handle missions that broke other men. He would volunteer for the most dangerous operations, the ones deep inside enemy territory where survival was never guaranteed. Word about Shriver spread quickly among American forces. Men who served with him said he fought with an intensity that shocked even hardened soldiers. He didn't hesitate when the bullets started flying. He attacked with speed and aggression, moving in ways that made him unpredictable. It wasn't long before soldiers started calling him Mad Dog. The name fit because, in battle, he seemed to unleash himself completely, without fear or pause. For the North Vietnamese, his name carried weight too. They knew there was a Green Beret out there who fought with a kind of fury that made him nearly impossible to pin down. Even among America's elite fighters, he became a figure of awe. Some admired his courage. Others thought he was reckless, taking risks that bordered on suicidal. As the missions piled up, the war began to change him. Each time he came back from the jungle, he seemed a little colder. Friends noticed he laughed less than he used to. He became more distant, speaking less, and keeping his guard up even around his own men. It was as if part of him had gone into the darkness of the jungle and stayed there. Vietnam was no longer just his duty. It became his entire identity. The battlefield was the only place where he felt at home, and the war fed the darker side of his nature. Shriver was not the kind of soldier who stayed in one camp for long. He was constantly moving, sent wherever the toughest jobs were. He worked under MAC-VSOG, which stood for the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. This was one of the most secret units in the entire war. Their work was so dangerous and so hidden that even most American soldiers in Vietnam didn't know the full details of what they did. Shriver and the men of SOG crossed borders into places the U.S. government denied sending troops, like Laos and Cambodia. These countries were supposed to be off limits, but the enemy was using them as safe havens and supply routes. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lifeline that carried weapons and men from North Vietnam into the south, ran right through these jungles. If the Americans wanted to cut the enemy's strength, they had to strike there. That meant sending in men like Shriver. These missions were always high risk. The teams were small, sometimes only 6 to 12 men, facing enemy forces that numbered in the hundreds. Their jobs ranged from sabotaging supply routes to planting mines, tapping enemy phone lines, rescuing captured pilots, or simply gathering proof of enemy movements. Every time they stepped off a helicopter into that thick jungle, they knew the odds of coming back alive were slim. In 1967, Shriver's name began to spread after one particular mission. He was leading a small group deep into enemy territory to hit a North Vietnamese convoy moving along the trail. The convoy was heavily guarded, and the jungle around them was crawling with enemy soldiers. Most men would have avoided it, but Shriver pushed forward. His team set up an ambush, and when the trucks rolled in, they opened fire. The fight was fierce, and the enemy outnumbered them many times over. But Shriver kept his men steady. He moved quick, directed the attack, and made sure they pulled out before being completely surrounded. They inflicted heavy damage and still managed to escape. When stories like this made their way back to camp, they spread fast. Soldiers started whispering about Mad Dog. Some believed he had a sixth sense in the jungle, that he could feel danger before it struck. Others thought he was simply too wild to die. But there was another side to this. With each mission, the danger grew heavier. The line between survival and death became thinner every time he stepped into the field. Shriver kept walking that line, almost as if he was testing it, daring it to break. Every time he returned, men shook their heads in disbelief, wondering how much longer he could keep beating the odds. By 1968, Vietnam had turned into a nightmare for everyone involved. That year brought the Tet Offensive, one of the largest and most shocking campaigns of the war. The Viet Cong, supported by the North Vietnamese Army, launched a massive surprise attack during the Lunar New Year holiday, a time when both sides were expecting to be quiet. Instead, they struck more than 100 towns and cities all across South Vietnam, hitting not just remote villages, but also major cities that were thought to be safe. The attacks reached places no one thought possible. Even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, the very symbol of American power in Vietnam, was assaulted by enemy fighters who fought their way onto the embassy grounds. Suddenly, the war was not just in the jungles or distant provinces. It was at the heart of the South Vietnamese capital. For soldiers and civilians alike, it felt like nowhere was safe anymore. The fighting was everywhere at once, and the death toll was staggering. In just weeks, more than 30,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters were killed. But the cost for the other side was devastating too. Thousands of American soldiers died, and tens of thousands of South Vietnamese troops and civilians were killed or wounded. Cities were left in ruins, villages were burned, and entire families were displaced. For the South Vietnamese people, daily life was shattered overnight. Back in the United States, leaders had promised the public that the war was being won, that victory was within reach. The Tet Offensive proved otherwise. Televised images of burning cities, street battles, and body bags coming home showed a different story. It became clear that the war was not under control at all. Confidence in the government's words collapsed. And for many Americans, Tet was the moment they realized the war had no clear end. In the middle of this storm was Shriver. Men like him were sent straight to the hardest battles. For soldiers on the ground, the Tet Offensive was pure chaos, street fighting, surprise ambushes, and attacks in places once thought safe. But for Shriver, it was fuel for his legend. He took missions when others hesitated. He led his men into situations where the chance of survival was almost nothing, and somehow kept coming back again. This was the time when stories about him began to sound larger than life. Some soldiers swore he was untouchable, that bullets seemed to miss him. Others whispered that he no longer cared if he lived or died, that he fought like a man with nothing to lose. For someone who had spent years walking on the edge of death, maybe the idea of dying in battle no longer frightened him at all. But behind those whispers was a human being carrying a heavy weight. By then, Shriver had seen more violence than most men could imagine. He had lost close friends, men he had trained with and trusted, to ambushes and sudden explosions. Every mission meant another risk, another body, another memory added to the pile. That kind of loss leaves scars that don't heal. Those who knew him noticed the change. The man who once had been full of energy and drive now seemed colder. He spoke less and trusted almost no one. He carried himself like someone who had already given a part of his soul to the war. For Shriver, Vietnam was no longer just a place where he served. It had consumed him. By the spring of 1969, Shriver had already spent years in Vietnam. Most soldiers were sent home after 1 year. Some who were determined or simply unlucky went back for a second tour. But Shriver had gone far beyond that. He kept signing on, again and again, until the war became his entire life. On April 24, 1969, he prepared for what would turn out to be his final mission. It wasn't a large-scale attack, but a reconnaissance operation, the kind of mission that required absolute stealth. Intelligence reports suggested that a North Vietnamese Army headquarters was hidden across the border inside Cambodia. This was an extremely sensitive area because officially, U.S. forces weren't supposed to be operating there. But the enemy was using Cambodian soil as a safe zone, moving troops and supplies with little resistance. The Americans wanted proof of this base, and they wanted to hit it if they could. Mac V. Sog took the task, and when the call went out for someone to lead the mission, Shriver stepped forward without hesitation. His reputation for walking into impossible situations made him the natural choice. He would command a small group of men, 9 in total, made up of a mix of American Green Berets and South Vietnamese Special Forces. These teams were always small because their survival depended on speed and secrecy, not on heavy numbers. The group boarded helicopters and were flown into the Cambodian jungle. The landing zone was tight, surrounded by thick trees that blocked the sun and muffled every sound. When they touched down, everything seemed strangely calm. There were no signs of enemy patrols, no movement, no noise beyond the insects and the hum of the jungle. At first, this quiet seemed like good luck, but soon, it felt wrong. Shriver had been in the jungle long enough to know when something was off, and silence this deep was usually a sign of danger. The team began moving through the dense undergrowth, cutting a path and keeping their eyes open. Hours passed and still nothing happened. Then, almost without warning, the world around them exploded. Gunfire tore through the trees from every direction. Shriver and his men had walked straight into an ambush. The intelligence had been right. There was a major enemy base in the area, and they were now trapped inside its defenses. Reports later suggested that hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers had surrounded them. Shriver's team was outnumbered by more than 50 to 1. Automatic rifles cracked from the tree lines. Grenades and mortars blasted the ground, and the jungle became a wall of smoke, dirt, and screams. The Americans and their South Vietnamese allies fought back with everything they had, but it was clear from the start that survival was nearly impossible. Radio transmissions captured fragments of the chaos. Calls for extraction came through, broken by the sound of gunfire and explosions. The voices on the radio revealed desperation. Men shouting over the noise, begging for helicopters to come before it was too late. The enemy fire was so heavy that helicopters struggled to get close enough without being shot down. In the middle of the storm, Shriver kept moving. Witnesses later said he charged forward again and again, firing his weapon to give his men cover. When enemy forces pressed in, he pushed back hard, trying to create space for his team to escape. His actions gave the others a chance to pull back toward the extraction point, even as the jungle floor was shredded with bullets. The last confirmed sight of Shriver was of him running into the smoke, weapon in hand, laying down fire as he disappeared deeper into the fight. His men tried to hold on long enough for helicopters to arrive. When rescue finally came, only a handful of survivors were pulled out. Shriver was not among them. He had vanished into the chaos, and no trace of him was ever recovered. For the men who escaped, the image of Shriver charging into the gunfire was burned into their memories. No one ever saw him alive again. His body was never recovered. That left a shadow of doubt that has never gone away. Some believed he died in the firefight, cut down by the overwhelming number of enemy soldiers. Others thought he had been captured and dragged deeper into Cambodia or North Vietnam, disappearing into the hidden network of jungle prison camps. In those years, many American soldiers who vanished without a trace ended up in brutal conditions as prisoners of war. These camps were often nothing more than bamboo cages in the jungle, where men starved, grew sick, and were beaten daily. Some soldiers survived for months or even years in these places before their lives ended. Because Shriver's body was never found, people imagined he might have met the same fate. Rumors spread quickly among veterans and families of the missing. Some said Shriver was executed shortly after capture, his death kept secret by the North Vietnamese. Others believed he lived on for a time, refusing to break under torture until the very end. There was never proof, only whispers and speculation. Officially, the U.S. military listed him as missing in action. For his family back in Florida, that meant no certainty, no grave, and no final goodbye. They received only his name, etched onto the long list of men who never came home. For them, the war never really ended. The mystery of what happened to Jerry Mad Dog Shriver has followed them for decades, leaving an emptiness that no medal, report, or rumor could ever fill.